So this podcast, we're really going to start talking about oxidation and reduction. And oxidation and reduction are two things that have to happen at the same time for electrons to move from one place to another. So you might just have this in your notes, what oxidation and reduction mean. And to know this, we're going to remember this, that Leo, who's a lion, says grrr. You might put your hands up, and Leo says grrr. Alright? And all that means is, if something loses electrons, it is oxidized. And if something gains electrons, it is reduced. Alright, so the way that's going to play out is we're going to look up here, and just like the other day we learned how to assign oxidation numbers. So we're going to look at these three equations, and we're just going to assign oxidation numbers. I'm going to write those values above the element. So in this compound, one of our rules is hydrogen has a +1 unless it's with a nonmetal, unless it's with a metal. So it's with a nonmetal, so hydrogen is a +1 right here. Bromine, because compounds always have to add up to 0, bromine is a -1. Calcium, because it's an element by itself, is 0. Over here, calcium is with bromine, so calcium is a +2. In bromine, there's two of them, so it's a -1 still like it normally is. And then hydrogen is now an element by itself, so it is 0. 0, not a 6. Alright, we're just going to keep on going actually. So oxygen down here is by itself, so it's a 0. Nitrogen is by itself, it's a 0. Down here, oxygen is usually a -1. I'm sorry, a -2, just like its charge usually is. And in this case, we have 3 oxygens. So because we have 3, that's 3 times -2. So in this case, nitrogen is really a +6. Alright? And then down here, potassium chlorate, perchlorate, or chlorate. Potassium is an alkaline metal, so it's always +1. Oxygen is usually a -2. So there's 3 of them, so altogether that's -6. But we have +1, so chlorine must be a +5. Because +1 + 5 - 6 = 0. And then down here, potassium is a +1, which means chlorine is a -1. And then over here, oxygen is a 0. Alright, so if you're just trying to determine if something's being oxidized or reduced, we know oxidized means it loses electrons, and reduction means it gains electrons. But I want to focus on this word right here. Alright, reduced. What's reduced mean? It gets smaller. So as you go from left to right, if the oxidation number gets smaller, that thing is being reduced. And the opposite has to also be true. If it's getting bigger, it must be being oxidized. So what I want you to do is memorize that if it gets smaller, it's reduced, which makes complete sense. And we're going to see how that means it's gaining electrons. Alright? So for now, if we go up to our first equation and find hydrogen, it goes from a 1 to a 0. Right? So that's getting smaller. So we might just put over here, hydrogen is reduced. Alright, well if one thing is reduced, it means that something else has to be oxidized. So let's look. Bromine's a -1, bromine's a -1. That means that bromine isn't really happening in this equation. It's not gaining electrons, it's not losing electrons, it's kind of just watching what's going on. And then calcium's going from a 0 to a +2. So is that getting smaller? No. So calcium must be being oxidized. Okay, so we're going to go to our next equation now. Oxygen starts as a 0, and now over here oxygen is a -2. Oh, that must mean that oxygen is being reduced. And let's look at nitrogen. It starts as a 0, and it changes to a +6. So that's definitely not being reduced. So nitrogen must be being oxidized. Alright, in our last equation, we have K starts as a +1, and it ends as a +1. Oh, nothing happened. We start with chlorine going from a 5 plus 5 to a -1. Whoa, chlorine is being reduced by a lot. So we're going to get reduced. And then lastly, we have oxygen going from a -2 to a 0. Alright? So in this case, oxygen is getting bigger. So notice in these examples that you can't just memorize oxygen's reduced, oxygen's oxidized. You always have to look at the oxidation numbers in any given equation. So up here, oxygen was reduced, but down here, oxygen is oxidized. So that is assigning oxidation numbers, which we've already done, and then determining which element is oxidized and which element is reduced. Know these two definitions, not just that the number gets smaller, but know that oxidation means lose electrons and reduction means gain electrons.